Hi, welcome to Chapter 8. America secedes from the Empire, 1775 to 1783. We're going to be covering the first sections today. George Washington is drafted by Congress all the way up through Paine and Republicanism. So we have bloodshed after the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19th, 1775. And then the British lost 73 men on their way back to Boston as the Americans hid in the ditches and the trees and picked them off. And so at this point, the war is pretty much on. There are some last attempts to try to reconcile with the British. But in response to this, to the growing tension, to the violence, to the bloodshed, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1775. And the situation was so dire because, the battles at Lexington and Concord and the American militia just kind of surrounding Boston at that point, that all 13 colonies were represented. Even little Rhode Island, who always just wanted to make sure that they were heard, showed up to the Second Continental Congress. Their objective was to draft a set of appeals to which the King George III, would respond because they felt that Parliament had been picking on them, and Parliament wasn't passed these acts, and Parliament's the one who closed Boston Harbor with the Coercive or Intolerable Act, so they're going to appeal to the rightful judgment of King George III to step in on their behalf and say, look, we're trying to be reasonable. Please fix this. We know we killed some of your troops. Can we please still get along? They're trying to avoid all-out war because the British are just so powerful, and it looks like a daunting task. In the meantime, they do prepare for war just in case. They draft George Washington as the commander-in-chief. He was one of the representatives of Virginia. He was a man from the House of Burgesses. That's why I'm wearing my shirt here. George Washington, original gangster. People have asked why he's West Side, but, we're west of Great Britain. Congress created the National Army of 15,000 men, and Washington was selected because he probably had the most military experience in America. We don't have military schools here. There's not really a lot of men that have fought in battle. Even though he blundered in the French and Indian War with getting captured and not following orders, he had a reputation of being a strong leader. He also looked the part. He was 6'2". He was regal. He kind of kept to himself. He was quiet, and he just carried himself like a leader. The day that he was selected by Congress, he kind of had a hunch that things were up. He actually wore his uniform to the session to vote him into power, and he almost acted surprised, like, me? Are you sure? And anytime Washington was selected in his life, he always was very humble about it and said, are you sure you're making the right choice here? Is there anyone else? But he kind of knew ahead of time what was going on. He did lack military knowledge and experience in terms of comparison to the British with their elite schools and their generals that had been battle tested against, the French and the Prussians and other troops like that. He did refuse pay for his services. He did not want to be paid, which is strange because Washington was always strapped for cash throughout his life. In fact, he had to take out a loan to pay for his own, to get to his own inauguration party. But he did keep track of all of his expenses, which totaled over $100,000. Washington did live a nice life for being in the military. He always had plenty to eat. He was very proud of his big stomach and big thighs because that was a sign of wealth and power back then. He also was very fond of espionage, and so he hired a lot of spies to do some of the work to gather information on the British. And then also for Congress, being from Virginia kind of brought the colonies together. This whole mess had really been in Boston. It had been in New England, it had been Massachusetts, and that region was seen as a troublemaker area. So if they picked another Bostonian or a New Englander, it would kind of isolate the South. And so by picking a Virginian, which was the most populated colony at the time, it brought the South. It brought these other middle colonies into the foray to fight the British as well. Here's a portrait of George Washington here standing with his cannon. A lot of portraits of him done throughout the years, and this kind of shows, he's defeating the British. Here's his actual uniform that they have in the Smithsonian. Washington, even though he's an American patriot, he loved British goods. Most of his clothes were tailored in Britain and shipped to America. So, in the meantime, there's some skirmishes and some battles going on. In upstate New York in May 1775, a small American force led by Ethan Allen from Vermont, which wasn't one of the colonies, but they actually declared independence from the British before the United States. He and then Benedict Arnold captured the British garrisons at Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. This was important because they had a lot of artillery and gunpowder that was secured at Fort Ticonderoga. And that's something the Americans are really lacking, is artillery and gunpowder and just general supplies. The British had anything they needed. 20,000 militiamen in the meantime assembled around Boston, kind of gathered there. And this is what Washington kind of runs into when he eventually gets there. So there is a major battle on June 16th, 1775. Colonel William Prescott took the defense of Bunker Hill. That's the name of the Battle of Bunker Hill, but it's actually fought on Breed's Hill, which is across the Charles River from Boston Harbor. Boston Harbor, and where proper Boston was. And so they lined up on the high ground, and the British, being full of themselves and thinking these American rebels couldn't put up a fight, they mistakenly, erroneously charged up an incline. You're not supposed to charge up a hill. Usually in war, it's a bad idea. They charged twice, and the Americans turned them back with their volleys. But by the third time, they're running low on ammo. Prescott, ordered his troops to not fire until they saw the white of the British eyes. By the third charge, they were desperate for ammunition. They were jamming rocks and nails into their guns, but they had to give up the hill because they ran out of ammunition. And so they retreated. But when the smoke cleared from the Battle of Bunker Hill, 1,054 British were killed. Out of their 2,000-man force, 450 Americans were killed at this battle. But what it did is it gave America confidence. It showed that the United States, well, we're not the United States yet, but America could stand toe-to-toe with this highly trained, superbly equipped army and fight them. They could have won the battle if they simply had enough ammunition. So it gave the American cause hope. It also is kind of the point of no return. After you kill 1,000 British, you're really not going to have any reconciliation with the king. Good luck with those petitions. So it gave Americans hope and confidence in this battle. And there's a painting of Bunker Hill here. Some more artist renditions of what's going on there at Bunker Hill and the columns storming up. And the Americans just firing down at them. Got a lot of it. It's a very, very famous battle. It's the first major battle of the American Revolution. And even though technically it's an American loss, it really lifted spirits as a moral victory for the United States, or what would become America. This is modern-day Bunker Hill. You can see the obelisk there across Boston Harbor, Boston Harbor, as they would say. And there's the obelisk there. You can actually go up into it and see really cool views of Boston. It's the end of the Freedom Trail, and there's a statue of Colonel William Prescott there. So Congress, in the meantime, while they were drafting Washington and getting 15,000 men, and they're going to pay these men, not just the militia, they also drafted the Olive Branch Petition, which was the last-ditch effort to get peace from King George III. It basically said, "Oh, King, Parliament's picking on us. Can you please help us out? They're being a jerk." And about the same time that the king receives a letter, the Olive Branch Petition from Congress, he also received word of the Battle of Bunker Hill and learned of these 1,000 dead British. This was on July 8, 1775, that he received all of this. And so shortly after this, he issues his August of 1775 proclamation, which stated the colonies were in a state of rebellion, which means they are committing the highest crime possible against your country, treason, punishable by death. 1 month later, to show his disgust, he hired 30,000 German troops to come fight. They were Hessians, which is a kingdom or region of Germany, and so not only did he reject the Olive Branch Petition, he basically said that we're in rebellion, we're committing treason, and he sent 30,000 Germans to come get us. Jerk. He also urged the Navy to blockade the colonies. The Royal Navy was the greatest in the world at that time. Boston Harbor's closed, so they're going to try to starve America out. And lastly, Lord North, the Prime Minister, passed the American Prohibitory Acts, which banned all trade with America, trying to get back at us what we did with the boycotts of the non-importation agreements, that basically they're going to starve America out, starve us into submission to squelch and squash this rebellion. Close our harbors, ban all trade with us, send 30,000 Germans. Anybody that's a leader of this is going to be tried for treason, and basically crush the rebellion like any good emperor or king would do. The Reconciliationists, this was their lost. They lost their hope. There was no more turning back. There was no hope of negotiating a peace. If America was going to be free and settle this dispute, they were going to have to win the war. Which we're up to the task, right? So, in 1775, the British, because we're in rebellion, started retaliating. They burned Falmouth, what is Portland, Maine, which really kind of upset a lot of Americans. In the same month, the colonists attacked Canada. We've tried to invade Canada twice, the Americans, not when we were part of the British, and we failed. Sorry, Canada. We tried to invade you twice, and we've never succeeded at it. So, Canada, man, you guys can hold your own. That's pretty awesome. Maybe someday. Who knows? They hoped that they could add a 14th colony in Canada. The attack failed when General Richard Montgomery was killed. And if you look at the map, you can see that he's up there on the St. Lawrence River. He moved north from upstate New York, tried to take Montreal, and move up towards Quebec. Benedict Arnold also led forces. Yes, that Benedict Arnold, he was actually a pretty good soldier, but it was his crazy wife that kind of turned him against us and whispered naughty things in his ears. He moved up through Maine and attacked Quebec, but it was ultimately a failure. Benedict Arnold was wounded in the leg. And in retaliation for this, in January 1776, the British burned the town of Norfolk, Virginia, which is the head of many of our ships that are made for the Navy today. It's a major harbor for the Navy. Now, Washington reached Boston in July 1775. The day he was selected by the Second Continental Congress, he was wearing his uniform, immediately rode off to find his troops. When he reached there, he learned of the victory at Fort Ticonderoga, and so he sent one of his personal confidants, Henry Knox, to go retrieve the artillery. And so when he gets there, he finds the most undisciplined, unorganized, leaderless, ragtag army firsthand. They're drunk. They don't have guns. They don't have shoes. It's like the bad news bears of armies. And he has to train this military and this army, this militia, to fight the best equipped, regarded as one of the best armies in the world. It's a daunting task for Washington. And the greatness of Washington is not his tactics. It's not his military genius. It's his leadership. It's holding them together when all looks lost. He's always, he's a strong leader. He's always out front, and he leads by example. He has strong character, but he keeps things together. On March 5th, 1776, Washington secured Dorchester Heights outside of Boston. What happened was Henry Knox successfully drugged 59 cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. It was just an arduous journey through muddy roads and they had to ford rivers and they had to build rafts and things like that. And there was snow and mud and who knows, locusts. But it was such a phenomenal feat that for the rest of his life, Washington had, he had confidence in Henry Knox. And it took him 75 days to do this. So in the night before March 5th, they put all the cannons up on Dorchester Heights, and the troops, they surrounded it, and the British in the morning looked up and went, oh dear, we're in trouble now. Maybe we should go. And so the British fled Boston. General Howe knew it was indefensible. He'd been surrounded for months. There's no way to break out. So the British, using the Navy, left for Halifax, Nova Scotia to regroup, to find another place where they can invade America, where they could use their strength, where the Navy could really do damage, and maybe where there's more of a loyalist population, unlike Boston, which was full of patriots. And so Washington thinks, people give him credit. He had his first victory. He really saved Boston without firing a shot. Luckily for Americans, the British didn't torch the city when they left. But he knew this was a false victory. And he correctly predicted that the next battle was going to be at New York. So the victory was short-lived for him. He moved his troops quickly to New York to try to build defense, breastworks and things like that for the impending invasion of New York City, which is to come in the next segment. In the meantime, Thomas Paine, an Englishman who came to America, published a little pamphlet called Common Sense. And he put into words what a lot of Americans had been thinking and saying and talking about, but he just kind of consolidated it to where people went, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's really good. He urged Americans to quit squabbling over taxes, quit squabbling over rights, and focus on the bigger prize. It's not about money. It's about your own country. It's about freedom. In the movie Braveheart, William Wallace is being gutted at the end of the movie. I mean, it's excruciating. And at the very end, they think he's going to yell mercy. And the guy leans in and goes, the prisoner wishes to speak. And everyone thinks he's going to say mercy. And he yells out, freedom! and it inspires the crowd, and the eyes lit up in the crowd. And if you watch that movie, the hair stands up on your neck, and your heart flutters, and that gets you going, man. That inspires you. If you would have yelled, "No taxation without representation," probably doesn't have the same effect. In fact, it's hard to yell when you're, being gutted like a fish. So, freedom, man, that inspires people. That gets people behind your cause. It gives them a reason to fight. Nowhere in the universe did he claim did a smaller heavenly body control a larger one. Great Britain was a small country. America is big. Basically, embrace your bigness. Your big-boned America, go with it. Be a plus-size model. He also stated that, and correctly, you couldn't get any foreign aid without declaring independence. France and Spain would love to get back at Britain, especially for the 7 Years' War. If you declare independence, they can ally with you, they can give you money, they can recognize you, give you troops, and they can help you secure the freedom. But they can't do that until you declare independence, until you file for divorce from Britain. It inspired thousands of Americans. It put into words what people were feeling. And it sold 500,000 copies, which is astounding because there's only about 4 to 5 million people in the whole country at the time. So that's a significant chunk of Americans that bought copies of this pamphlet. And here's Thomas Paine. Here's an old painting of him. He called for both independence and a republic to be formed. Not only are we going to form our own country, but we're going to do something radical that nobody else has done in modern times. We're going to let the people rule. Not aristocrats, not a king, not an emperor, you name it. The people are going to be in charge. But it's a republic. We're not going to have a direct democracy. The country's too big. It's too spread out. And so we are going to elect people to vote for us. That's the form of a republic. Americans were used to this form of government. All 13 colonies had aspects of a republic. And so it was nothing new. It wasn't radical for the United States, which would become the United States. It was something we were used to. Many leaders, the leaders who were in Congress, were familiar with the Enlightenment writers of Hobbes and Locke, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, not Hoggs, who talked about social contract. That basically people give up their absolute freedom. In return, the government will protect them. And Locke said it is your right, it is your duty to throw off such guards. Thomas Jefferson kind of plagiarizes some of that. And then we're all, endowed by our Creator there to be, certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, is what John Locke said. And once again, Jefferson kind of takes that and plagiarizes it, but he didn't get in trouble because he's Thomas Jefferson. And so basically that's the idea, that there's a piece of paper that guarantees your rights, and the government's going to protect you, and you give up your absolute freedom. That contract will eventually become known as our Constitution. Those ideas our founding fathers were aware of. They read about, they talked about them. The average American person, farmer didn't really read the Enlightenment, but they knew the idea of self-government. The collective good of the people mattered more than individual interest to them, but not all agreed with him. There were many Americans, including our founding fathers, who believed in a natural aristocracy, that there was few elements of democracy that should be, instituted, that basically the people can't be trusted. The mob, yes, you need them to beat the British, but you don't want the mob in charge because the mob is fickle. If you really do some digging and some reading, there are many, many quotes from our founding fathers that did not want you, the people, in charge. And if you look at the original form of our government, first, the Articles of Confederation, and second, the original form of the Constitution, the only thing the people directly had ties to elect was the House of Representatives. So you can see some of that conflict going on. In fact, Thomas Paine is a little bit of a radical in terms of American politics because he wants to give the people too much power back then. And the likes of Washington and Jefferson and Adams and Hancock and you keep going on, Patrick Henry, Ben Franklin, they're not willing to give up that power to the people just yet. So tune in next time. That's the end of section 1. Next time we'll be talking about the Declaration of Independence and some of the actual battles. If you have any questions or comments, throw them in the comments on YouTube. I hope you enjoy this. Good night.